He rose from Germany's ruins with fire in his voice and hatred in his heart. At every rally, one name echoed as the enemy, the Jews. But why this obsession? Why did Hitler blame one person for every crisis? The chilling truth lies in centuries of prejudice and twisted ideology. Berlin, 1919. The war was lost, the Kaiser gone, and the streets filled with starving veterans. Germany bled from humiliation, millions jobless, inflation turning bread into gold. Amid the ruins, a former soldier named Adolf Hitler sat in beer halls, listening, raging, and searching for someone to blame. He found his answer in an ancient lie that the Jews were responsible. For centuries, Europe had carried myths about Jews, greedy moneylenders, Christ killers, conspirators in the shadows. In desperate post-war Germany, these poisonous stories spread like wildfire. Hitler seized them, reshaped them, and thundered them to crowds hungry for hope. He promised salvation not through rebuilding, but through hatred, through identifying and destroying a single enemy. The propaganda machine painted Jews as both communist revolutionaries and capitalist manipulators, a contradiction that hardly mattered. What mattered was that people listened. Slowly, a prejudice older than Germany itself was weaponized into a political creed and eventually into a program of annihilation. But why did Hitler obsess so violently over the Jews? What dark mix of history, ideology, and personal obsession turned prejudice into genocide? In this video, we'll uncover the roots of Hitler's hatred and how it led to humanity's darkest chapter. Chapter 1. Roots of an Obsession. The historical background of anti-Semitism. The story does not begin with Hitler. Long before his rise, Europe had already sown the seeds of anti-Semitism. For centuries, Jews were painted as outsiders, blamed for plagues, accused of poisoning wells, and targeted during times of crisis. By the 19th century, these myths were deeply rooted in European culture. In Austria, where Hitler grew up, anti-Semitism was not whispered. It was shouted from newspapers, pulpits, and political rallies. The mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, openly used anti-Jewish rhetoric to win elections, proving hatred could be a path to power. This atmosphere shaped the young Hitler. He absorbed these ideas before he ever set foot in politics. But hatred alone does not explain his obsession. It was the collapse of empires, economic despair, and Germany's crushing defeat in World War I that gave Hitler's prejudice a stage. Millions of Germans, humiliated and desperate, were searching for someone to blame. Hitler gave them an answer: the Jews. To understand Hitler's mindset, one must trace anti-Semitism to its religious origins. For centuries, Jews were vilified as Christ killers, accused of rejecting Jesus, and condemned in sermons across Europe. Medieval Europe enforced laws confining Jews to ghettos, banning them from land ownership, and restricting professions. They were forced into money lending, a profession scorned yet essential, further fueling resentment. This long-standing prejudice meant that when economic or social crises erupted, Jews were often the first scapegoats. During the Black Death in the 14th century, mobs accused Jewish communities of spreading the plague, leading to massacres. These narratives survived in cultural memory, passed down from generation to generation, until they became a permanent stain on European consciousness. By Hitler's era, anti-Semitism was no longer just religious. It had become racial, pseudoscientific, and political. Jews were not just accused of religious crimes, they were seen as an alien race conspiring against nations. Vienna, at the turn of the 20th century, was both a hub of culture and a breeding ground of hate. It was a city where Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis, where Gustav Klimt painted masterpieces, and where intellectual debates flourished, but beneath its gilded surface lay deep tensions. Vienna had a significant Jewish population, many of whom were successful in business, medicine, and the arts. Their success made them visible, and in the eyes of struggling lower-class Austrians, as dangerously influential. Karl Lueger, the city's populist mayor, weaponized this resentment. He mocked Jews in speeches, yet maintained Jewish friends when it suited him, showing how anti-Semitism could be both a tool and a weapon. Young Adolf Hitler, living in Vienna as a failed art student, absorbed these messages. He wandered the streets, often homeless, watching as Jewish intellectuals, businessmen, and professionals thrived in ways he could not. To him, their success became proof of an alleged conspiracy. His personal failures fused with public prejudice, creating a toxic brew of resentment. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a dangerous shift. The transformation of anti-Semitism from religion into science. Writers and theorists in Germany and Austria began to frame Jews as a biological threat, incapable of assimilation. They spoke of racial purity, hierarchies of humanity, and the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, an English-born German nationalist, published works claiming Jews were destructive force in history. These texts spread widely, influencing German thought. Hitler later praised Chamberlain, seeing him as a prophet of his own worldview. This pseudoscience gave anti-Semitism a new foundation. No longer could Jews escape prejudice by converting to Christianity or assimilating into European culture. They were now seen as racially distinct, eternally foreign, and irredeemable. For Hitler, this racial framing was essential. It turned hatred into ideology, and ideology into destiny. While anti-Semitism was centuries old, Hitler's personal obsession was sharpened by the trauma of World War I. He served as a soldier on the Western Front, experiencing the brutality of trench warfare. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Hitler, like millions of others, was stunned. The defeat felt inexplicable. Germany's army had fought with ferocity. How could they have lost? The Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the humiliation. Germany was forced to accept blame for the war, pay crushing reparations, and surrender territory. For many Germans, this was not just a political defeat, but a national disgrace. Amid the chaos, a myth spread, the stab in the back legend. It claimed that Germany's brave soldiers had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed at home by traitors, communists, pacifists, and most of all, Jews. Though false, this myth resonated deeply. Hitler embraced it completely, cementing Jews in his mind as the ultimate enemy of Germany. It is easy to see Hitler's hatred as abstract, but it was also personal. As a young man, he failed repeatedly, denied admission to art school, living in poverty, and unable to find stable work. In Vienna and later Munich, he contrasted his own failures with the successes of Jewish professionals. Rather than confronting his shortcomings, Hitler externalized his anger. Jews, he believed, embodied everything that held him back: modernity, capitalism, socialism, and intellectualism. He saw them not as individuals, but as symbols of everything he despised. When he entered politics after World War I, these resentments found a platform. Anti-Semitism was not unique to him. Many German nationalists shared it, but Hitler weaponized it with unmatched intensity. He fused personal hatred with national grievance, turning prejudice into a political program. By the 1920s, Germany was a nation in turmoil. Hyperinflation wiped out savings, unemployment soared, and extremist movements thrived. Hitler, leading the fledgling Nazi Party, discovered the power of scapegoating. His speeches electrified crowds not just because he promised strength, but because he gave them someone to blame. He told Germans that Jews were behind communism, capitalism, and every humiliation the nation suffered. He claimed they corrupted culture, controlled finance, and weakened Germany from within. These conspiracy theories were not new, but Hitler delivered them with conviction, turning old myths into a unifying enemy. Anti-Semitism became the glue of his ideology. It connected his nationalism, his hatred of Marxism, and his vision of racial purity. Without anti-Semitism, Hitler's worldview would have been fractured. With it, everything made sense, at least to him and his followers. By the time Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in 1924, while imprisoned after his failed coup, his obsession with Jews was clear. He described them as parasites, corruptors of nations, and enemies of the Aryan race. His rhetoric was extreme, but it resonated with an audience already conditioned by centuries of prejudice. The book did not become an instant bestseller, but it planted seeds. As the Nazi movement grew, these ideas became central doctrine. What had once been personal resentment was now political strategy. The roots of Hitler's anti-Semitism were not born in a vacuum. They were watered by centuries of Christian prejudice, fertilized by pseudo-scientific racism, and sharpened by personal resentment and national humiliation. Vienna taught him the power of hatred. World War I gave him a narrative of betrayal, and the instability of post-war Germany gave him an audience desperate for answers. By the early 1920s, anti-Semitism was no longer just one part of Hitler's worldview. It was the lens through which he interpreted the world. Every failure, every defeat, every threat could be explained by pointing to the Jews. It was an obsession that would soon shape not only his politics, but the fate of millions. Chapter 2. Mein Kampf and the Racial Gospel. He did not just shout his hatred, he wrote it down. Page by page, Adolf Hitler turned his obsession into a political religion, a scripture of hate that would guide a nation. The book was Mein Kampf, my struggle, part autobiography, part manifesto, and entirely poisonous, written while he sat in a prison cell after the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. Hitler dictated his thoughts to Rudolf Hess, his loyal follower. The setting was hardly grand, a simple prison room, far removed from the rallies and torch-lit marches he once dreamed of. But in the stillness of confinement, he found something far more enduring than a speech, a written ideology, that would outlive the cell walls. This book, clumsy in style but powerful in message, became the skeleton of Nazi belief. It was here, in ink and paper, that the true contours of his hatred of the Jews crystallized into something systematic, something political, something almost theological. In Mein Kampf, Hitler painted history as a racial struggle, a never-ending war between peoples. To him, the Aryan stood at the top of the natural order, the bringer of culture, the master race destined to rule. The Jew, on the other hand, was cast as the eternal enemy, not merely a rival, but a parasite feeding on nations, corrupting morals, and spreading cocaine. This wasn't prejudice whispered in beer halls anymore. It was a doctrine, sharpened, polished, and presented as truth. Hitler told his readers that Germany's survival depended not only on rebuilding after World War I, but on purging itself of this supposed racial poison. He obsessed over race like a zealot. Every problem, defeat in war, economic collapse, unemployment, even modern art, became in his mind part of a Jewish conspiracy. Capitalism? A Jewish trick. Communism? Also Jewish. Liberal democracy? Another plot. It was a worldview where Jews controlled both ends of the spectrum, manipulating history to weaken nations and enslave them. To an audience desperate for answers after humiliation and hardship, Hitler's writing offered an explanation that was simple, cruel, and seductive. But there was something even more dangerous in Mein Kampf than the accusations. It was the promise. Hitler did not merely say Jews were a problem. He offered a solution. In his vision, the German people could be reborn only if they destroyed their enemy. That promise of national salvation through racial cleansing gave his words the weight of prophecy. For those willing to believe, Hitler became less a politician and more a kind of preacher, delivering a racial gospel where redemption was written in blood. The book did not become an overnight bestseller. When it first appeared in 1925, many dismissed it as rambling, repetitive, even boring. Critics laughed at its clunky style, its endless rants, its lack of structure. But history shows that dangerous ideas do not need to be well written to be effective. They only need to find the right audience. And slowly, Mein Kampf did. By the 1930s, as Hitler's power rose, the book spread across Germany. Newlyweds received it as a state gift. Schools and universities treated it as essential reading. By the time Hitler became Führer, millions of copies had been printed. What began as the angry musings of a failed revolutionary had become required doctrine for an entire nation. The heart of this doctrine was racial determinism. Hitler preached that the destiny of nations was decided not by politics, not by economics, but by blood. Every people, he wrote, was defined by its race, and every race had its place in the hierarchy. The Aryans were creators, the Slavs were laborers, and the Jews were destroyers. In his mind, they were not a religion or a culture, but a biological threat, an infection. This dehumanization was crucial. Once you convince people that a group is not fully human, anything becomes permissible. Persecution becomes protection. Violence becomes justice. In the book, Hitler also revealed another obsession: space. He believed Germany was crowded, starved of land, unable to grow. His solution was Lebensraum, or living space. He argued that the German people had the right to expand eastward, to seize lands in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, to colonize and dominate. This vision of conquest was inseparable from his hatred of Jews. In his warped worldview, conquering the East was not just about land, it was about purging the supposed Jewish influence he believed had poisoned Europe. Expansion and extermination were woven together, threads of the same nightmare. Every chapter dripped with paranoia. Hitler cast himself as a prophet, warning the world of a coming Jewish danger. He insisted that unless Germany acted, Jews would dominate global finance, media, politics, and culture. He saw them everywhere as invisible puppeteers controlling events. For readers already humiliated by defeat in war and crushed by the Treaty of Versailles, this scapegoating was intoxicating. Instead of facing the complexity of a broken world, they could cling to a simple story. Germany was pure, noble, victimized, and the Jews were to blame. What made Mein Kampf so dangerous was not only what it said, but how it was used. Nazi propagandists treated it as scripture. They quoted passages in newspapers, plastered slogans on walls, and preached its ideas in classrooms. Teachers read from it, youth organizations memorized it, soldiers carried it. The book was never just a memoir. It was a weapon. A generation was raised under its shadow, their minds shaped by its racial gospel, long before they ever picked up a rifle. Some contemporaries did see the danger. Winston Churchill, long before World War II, warned that Hitler's writings revealed ambitions for war and conquest. Others dismissed it as bluster, the ravings of a bitter man. But Hitler was telling the world exactly what he intended. He wrote that Jews must be eliminated, that war was inevitable, that peace was a delusion. And still, too many people ignored the warning. History would show the cost of such blindness. There was a chilling honesty in Hitler's dishonesty. He wrapped his lies about Jews in a framework that appeared consistent, even logical to those who wanted to believe. He painted himself as a visionary, a man chosen to rescue his people from decay. And as his power grew, Mein Kampf transformed from a book into a blueprint. Every policy of the Nazi regime, censorship, propaganda, racial laws, ghettos, concentration camps, could be traced back to sentences scrawled in that prison cell. Perhaps the most terrifying thought is this: Hitler's ideas did not emerge in a vacuum. He borrowed them from centuries of anti-Semitic myths, pseudo-scientific racial theories, and nationalist rhetoric. But what he did in Mein Kampf was fuse them into a single, burning creed. He gave them shape, focus, and above all, a mission. And when a nation desperate for meaning embraced that creed, words became weapons, and weapons became death. The racial gospel of Mein Kampf was not only about Jews. It laid the groundwork for the hierarchy of victims the Nazis would later persecute: Roma, disabled people, homosexuals, political dissidents, Slavs. But Jews remained the centerpiece, the obsession, the eternal enemy, the imagined shadow threatening to swallow the Aryan light. Hitler told his followers that history itself demanded their elimination. In his eyes, it was not cruelty, it was destiny. When the book spread, it changed the cultural atmosphere of Germany. Casual anti-Semitism hardened into political conviction. Hatred became policy. By the time Hitler stood on the steps of power, no one could claim surprise. The warning had been written in black and white. Millions of Germans had read it, quoted it, taught it, believed it, and millions of Jews would pay the price. To this day, Mein Kampf stands as one of history's most infamous books, a toxic blend of autobiography and ideology. It is proof that words can kill, not metaphorically, but literally. For the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers or bullets. It began with ideas, with sentences, with a man scribbling in a prison cell about race, struggle, and the destiny of nations. And in those pages, the blueprint for genocide was born. Chapter 3: Scapegoats in Crisis, Jews and Weimar Germany. Germany in the 1920s was a nation staggering through humiliation, hunger, and despair. The Kaiser was gone, the empire shattered, and the Treaty of Versailles hung like a noose around the country's neck. Reparations, territorial losses, and disarmament stripped Germany of its pride. But worse than the treaty was the collapse of everyday life. Hyperinflation in 1923 turned savings into dust overnight. A wheelbarrow of cash could not buy a loaf of bread. Families burned banknotes to heat their homes because money was cheaper than coal. And when the economy briefly stabilized, the Great Depression of 1929 struck like a hammer, shattering livelihoods, driving millions into unemployment, and plunging the Weimar Republic into chaos. This was the atmosphere in which Adolf Hitler thrived. He understood something dangerous. In times of crisis, people look not for complex truths, but for simple enemies, and he had already chosen his enemy, the Jews. He seized every disaster and funneled every grievance into a single explanation. To a crowd battered by inflation, he warned of Jewish bankers. To the unemployed, he railed against Jewish shopkeepers and profiteers. To nationalists mourning Germany's lost empire, he thundered about the Jewish stab in the back. What others saw as random misfortunes, Hitler presented as a coherent conspiracy, a deliberate attack by Jews to weaken and enslave Germany. The scapegoating was not new. The stab in the back myth had been born in the ashes of 1918, whispered by generals eager to deflect blame from themselves. They claimed that Germany had not truly lost the war on the battlefield, but had been betrayed from within by socialists, communists, and, crucially, Jews. Hitler absorbed this myth like oxygen. In speech after speech, he repeated it, turning rumor into dogma. For him, Jewish Marxists and Jewish financiers were two faces of the same monster, colluding to destroy nations. He would point to Kurt Eisner, the Jewish socialist who briefly led revolutionary Bavaria, as proof that Jews had engineered Germany's collapse. He thundered that Jews were behind both Bolshevism and Wall Street, controlling strikes and speculation alike. It was nonsense, but it offered what people craved, a clear villain. This strategy worked because it united diverse grievances under one banner. The farmer who lost his land, the shopkeeper facing bankruptcy, the war veteran living on crumbs, all could direct their rage toward the same scapegoat. Hitler's speeches were tailored to the audience. In rural towns, he warned of Jewish landowners exploiting peasants. In industrial cities, he railed against Jewish merchants cheating workers. He was a political chameleon, shifting his language but always pointing to the same target. The Holocaust Encyclopedia notes that Nazi anti-Semitism was carefully adjusted to appeal to different audiences, a grim reminder that bigotry can be marketed like a product. As the crises deepened, Hitler presented himself not just as a politician, but as an avenger of German honor. He promised to overturn Versailles, restore strength, and bring jobs, but always tied these promises to the elimination of Jewish influence. Germany cannot rise again, he declared, until the Jew is removed. To despairing crowds, these words were intoxicating. They gave misery a meaning and despair a direction. Propaganda amplified the message. Nazi posters depicted hook-nosed caricatures, clutching money bags, casting Jews as greedy profiteers. Bleeding Germany newspapers like Der Stürmer, edited by Julius Streicher, spewed endless venom, accusing Jews of everything from economic sabotage to moral corruption. Street rallies echoed with chants against the supposed Jewish conspiracy. Even cultural struggles were weaponized. Modern art was denounced as degenerate and Jewish. Jazz music was smeared as a Jewish-American corruption. Theater, film, and literature were accused of carrying hidden Jewish influence. In this narrative, Jews were not just bankers or communists. They were behind every corner of German life, poisoning it from within. The tragedy is that many ordinary Germans believed it. When your savings vanish overnight, it is easier to blame a shadowy cabal of bankers than the complexity of global markets. When your family goes hungry, it is easier to believe you were betrayed than to accept the impersonal cruelty of depression and debt. Hitler offered a story in which Germans were not failures, but victims, not weak, but wronged. And for millions, that story felt true. The electoral numbers tell the story of this manipulation. In 1908, the Nazis were a fringe party with less than 3% of the vote. But after the Great Depression struck, their support surged. By 1930, they had 18%. By 1930, they were the largest party in the Reichstag. Behind these numbers lay despair weaponized into hatred. Unemployment lines grew, businesses closed, and Nazi rallies filled with people who believed that salvation required the removal of Jews. Hitler's scapegoating also served another purpose. It created unity. Germany, in the Weimar years, was fractured. Left against right, monarchists against republicans, workers against capitalists. Hitler found a way to unite them through a shared enemy. Anti-Semitism became the glue of his movement, the banner under which nationalists, disillusioned soldiers, struggling farmers, and resentful shopkeepers could all march. Without this scapegoat, Nazi ideology might have remained too fragmented to succeed. With it, it became a mass movement. By the time Hitler was appointed chancellor in January 1933, anti-Semitism had moved from the margins to the mainstream. What had once been muttered in beer halls was now shouted in public squares. The Jewish minority, which had contributed enormously to German culture, science, and industry, suddenly found itself painted as the root of every problem. And for many Germans, that lie was easier to swallow than the bitter truth of economic collapse and political failure. The scapegoating of Jews during the Weimar crisis was not just a campaign tactic, it was the foundation of Nazi power. It trained a nation to see its neighbors as enemies, to equate prejudice with patriotism, to believe that redemption could only come through exclusion. And once that mindset took hold, it paved the way for policies that would soon move beyond words into action. Looking back, the lesson is chilling. A democracy weakened by crisis became fertile ground for lies. A people broken by war and depression accepted hatred as hope. And a demagogue skilled in turning fear into fury pointed to a scapegoat and promised salvation. By the time Germany realized the cost of believing him, the machinery of persecution was already in motion. The scapegoats had been chosen, the stage was set, and the next act of the tragedy was about to begin. Chapter 4, From Boycotts to Pogroms. The speeches were over. The words of hate had been written, shouted, and cheered. Now, Hitler's regime turned those words into action. On the morning of April 1st, now brown-shirted stormtroopers stood outside Jewish shops, offices, and businesses, daubing stars of David on windows and warning Germans not to enter. For the first time, hatred was no longer just an idea. It was law, uniform, and marching boots on the street. Customers were intimidated, Jews were humiliated, and the world saw the first public demonstration of Nazi anti-Semitism in action. This boycott lasted only a single day, but its impact was lasting. It sent a clear message. The Jews of Germany would no longer be considered full members of society. From that day onward, the machinery of discrimination accelerated. Hitler and his party did not wish to rely on mere rhetoric. They wanted law and order to codify their prejudice. In April 1933, the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service was passed. It forced Jews, along with political opponents, out of government jobs. Professors were dismissed from universities, judges were thrown out of courts, and teachers were removed from classrooms. A message rang out. Jews had no place in shaping the future of German society. Step by step, they were excluded from the professions that had long defined their lives. Doctors were stripped of patients, lawyers of their clients, and scholars of their voice. The process was deliberate. The Nazis cloaked each new law in the language of restoration and purity. By describing Jews as corrupting influences, Hitler justified their removal as a cleansing act. The propaganda machine, run by Joseph Goebbels, ensured that newspapers and films constantly reminded Germans of their supposed enemy within. Posters depicted Jews as greedy, parasitic, and dangerous. Children were taught to avoid them. Neighbors began to look at one another with suspicion. In 1935, this campaign culminated in the Nuremberg Laws, perhaps the most infamous legal codification of anti-Semitism in modern history. These laws stripped Jews of their citizenship, reducing them to mere subjects of the Reich without political rights. They forbade marriages and sexual relations between Jews and so-called Aryans, defining Jewishness not as a religion but as a race. It no longer mattered if a Jew was assimilated, secular, or even a decorated war veteran from the First World War. Their very blood, as the Nazis defined it, condemned them. With these laws, Jews ceased to be Germans. They became outsiders in their own homeland. Daily life became an exercise in humiliation and survival. Jews were banned from entering public parks, theaters, and swimming pools. They were forbidden from flying the German flag. Businesses they had built over generations were boycotted, vandalized, and seized under so-called Aryanization policies, where Jewish property was transferred to non-Jewish hands for fractions of its worth. Families who had once lived comfortably were reduced to poverty almost overnight. It was not just theft, it was erasure. Meanwhile, Hitler's speeches reinforced these actions. He spoke to crowded halls about the Jewish question, framing Jews as the eternal corruptors of nations. Each word from the Führer legitimized the violence and discrimination his followers carried out. The state became an instrument of hate, and ordinary Germans were encouraged to participate, not necessarily with fists or guns at first, but with silence, with compliance, and with complicity. By turning away when a Jewish neighbor lost his job, by refusing to shop at a Jewish store, or by spreading whispered rumors about Jews, the population became a vital cog in the machine of persecution. By 1938, the persecution escalated beyond law and social exclusion into organized violence. On the night of November 9th, the world witnessed what would later be called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues burned, Jewish-owned shops were smashed, and homes were ransacked. Windows shattered like gunfire, lighting the streets with shards of glass. Over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, their only crime being who they were. Firefighters stood by as synagogues burned, ordered to protect only non-Jewish property. Jews were made to pay for the destruction themselves, adding insult to devastation. Kristallnacht was a turning point. Until then, many Jews had hoped that the storm would pass, that the fever of anti-Semitism would cool. But on that night, any illusion of safety was destroyed. The violence was no longer spontaneous or grassroots. It was state-organized, deliberate, and sanctioned at the highest levels of power. Hitler's vision had moved from the margins to the mainstream, from prejudice to pogrom, and from words to blood. After Kristallnacht, emigration seemed the only escape, yet it was a cruel trap. The Nazis encouraged Jews to leave, but stripped them of their wealth before they could go. Meanwhile, many countries around the world closed their doors. At the Evian Conference in 1930, representatives from dozens of nations gathered to discuss the refugee crisis. One by one, they expressed sympathy, but refused to take significant numbers of Jewish refugees. The message was devastating. There was no safe haven. For Hitler, this rejection confirmed his belief that the Jews were unwanted everywhere, and it emboldened him to escalate his policies further. Life for the Jews who remained grew increasingly unbearable. They were forced to carry identification papers stamped with the letter J. Jewish children were expelled from schools. Professionals could no longer practice their trades. Families were crammed into smaller and smaller homes, segregated from the rest of society. The Nazi state pushed Jews into a corner, and once they were isolated, it became easier to target them. The stage was being set for something even darker, even deadlier than persecution. Throughout this process, propaganda never ceased. Goebbels orchestrated massive campaigns portraying Jews as the cause of all suffering. Films like Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew, dehumanized them, comparing Jews to rats that spread disease. This constant barrage of images and slogans seeped into the consciousness of ordinary Germans. Even those who might have doubted the rhetoric found themselves shaped by the culture of hate surrounding them. When violence erupted, it no longer seemed shocking. It seemed inevitable. Yet it is important to remember This was not a sudden explosion of hatred, but a steady erosion of rights, humanity, and dignity. Hitler understood that if he tried to eliminate Jews all at once in 1933, the world and his own people would have resisted. But by moving gradually, stripping away rights, enforcing segregation, normalizing propaganda, escalating to violence, he made the unthinkable possible. Each new step prepared Germans for the next. Boycotts softened into laws, laws hardened into pogroms, and pogroms paved the way for genocide. For the Jews of Germany, daily life became a test of endurance. Imagine waking each morning knowing that you could no longer go to the park with your children, that your shop window would be smashed, that your neighbors would look away, and that your very identity made you an outcast. Some resisted by holding on to their faith, their traditions, and their families. Others tried desperately to flee, selling what little they had to buy a passage abroad. But for most, escape was impossible. They were trapped in a country that had turned against them, ruled by a man whose hatred knew no limit. This was Hitler's war before the war. Long before tanks rolled into Poland, he had already declared war on an entire people within his own borders. And the silence of the world, the compliance of the masses, and the precision of the Nazi machine ensured that the Jews of Germany were not just marginalized, they were marked for destruction. The boycotts of 1933 were only the beginning. By the time Kristallnacht's fires burned, the path to the Holocaust was already being paved. Chapter 5. The Holocaust, Industrialized Murder. By the early 1940s, Hitler's war against the Jews had reached its most horrifying phase. The boycotts, the laws, the ghettos, and the pogroms were only preludes. Now, under the cover of World War Nazi ideology, we became genocide. Hitler and his lieutenants spoke of a final solution, a deceptively simple phrase that masked an unparalleled crime: the systematic extermination of European Jewry. The Holocaust was not chaos, it was calculated. It was not the work of mobs alone, but of a modern state that mobilized its trains, its industries, its soldiers, and its scientists toward one singular goal: the annihilation of the Jews. In occupied Poland, extermination camps rose from the ground like factories of death. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno, Majdanek, Belzec. The design was chilling in its efficiency. Trainloads of deportees arrived. Families were torn apart, and within hours most were stripped, herded into gas chambers disguised as showers, and murdered. Zyklon B pellets were poured in, and when the screaming ceased, slave laborers removed the bodies and burned them in crematoria. Beyond the camps, the killing fields of the East, soaked with blood. In towns and villages across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, Einsatzgruppen, roving SS death squads, rounded up entire communities. Men, women, and children were marched to pits or ravines and shot in mass executions. At places like Babi Yar, near Kyiv, tens of thousands were killed in just days. The perpetrators kept records. The photographs showed the faces. And the earth still hides countless graves. No Jewish community was spared. From the Warsaw Ghetto to the ghettos of Vilnius, Riga, and Lodz, starvation and disease prepared the way for deportations to the camps. In Thessaloniki, once a vibrant center of Jewish life, Trains emptied the city's Jews into Auschwitz's gates. From Paris, Amsterdam, Budapest, Minsk, Krakow, Salonika, Rome, everywhere the Nazis ruled, Jews were hunted, stripped of identity, and delivered into the machine of death. By 1945, two-thirds of Europe's Jews, 6 million men, women, and children, were gone. Hitler himself was rarely seen at the killing sites. He did not need to be. His fingerprints were in the orders signed, the policies approved, the speeches urging the destruction of the Jewish race. He did not swing the rifle or pour the gas pellets, but he created the system that did and demanded its completion. His obsession became the Reich's central mission. For the victims, the nightmare was beyond imagination. Even Jews who had endured the early boycotts or Kristallnacht could scarcely believe that their neighbors, their government, their homeland could descend into such barbarity. Many clung to hope, believing rumors of resettlement or labor camps. But when the truth was revealed, it was already too late. And yet, amid this darkness, there were sparks of resistance. Prisoners staged uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor. Jews in Warsaw fought back against the Nazis in 1943, holding out longer than entire nations had. Courage burned even in the face of certain death. And it reminds us that these 6 million were not faceless victims, but individuals, each with names, families, and dreams. Today, memorials like Yad Vashem in Jerusalem or the Shoah Memorial in Paris stand as stone testaments to their memory. Walls inscribed with names remind us this was not myth, not propaganda, not exaggeration. It was real. Every name is a life cut short. Every story in the world is destroyed. By 1945, Allied soldiers liberated camps and stumbled upon mountains of ashes, skeletal survivors, and warehouses of shoes and hair. The full truth was laid bare. The Holocaust was the logical conclusion of Hitler's hatred. Anti-Semitism taken to its ultimate genocidal end. Hitler's blind hatred ended in history's darkest crime, the murder of 6 million Jews. Each life lost is a warning of where prejudice can lead when left unchecked. Remember their stories. If this video moved you, like it, subscribe to our channel, and join us as we uncover more hidden truths of the past.